we ask that you hold all questions to the end. We'll have a short Q&A period at the end. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ben Lee, who's from George Mason University. He's going to say a little bit about the seminar.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Ben Lee. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Statistics at George Mason University. And along with Jonathan, I help organize the R. Clifton Bailey Statistics Seminars. Our seminars are generally held during the academic year each Friday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. And our seminars are held in person and remotely. So for the rest of the seminar, we have a great slate of speakers, including David Banks, Roger Peng, and Annie Q. So we welcome everyone here in this room today to join us each Friday. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And then I'm going to introduce Catherine Aramata, who's from the Washington Statistical Society, and then she'll introduce the speakers, and we'll start with the Q&A part, the interview. So Catherine, take it away.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. As Jonathan said, my name is Catherine Aramata, and I'm the Methodology Section Chair for the Washington Statistical Society. We're excited to be able to co-host this event today with George Mason University, and really excited for this event on election forecasting. The WSS hosts several methodology seminars throughout the year, as well as some short courses, which we advertise through our listserv and on our website. Our next event is actually going to be a short course on using Quarto and RStudio, which will be held on November 20th, and registration for that short course will open up shortly, so keep an eye out for that. So now turning over to today's event, I'm pleased to be able to introduce our two guests, Dr. Andrew Gelman and Dr. Edward Wu. Andrew Gelman is a professor of statistics and political science at Columbia University. His books include Bayesian Data Analysis, Regression and Other Stories, Active Statistics, and Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, Why Americans Vote the Way They Do. He and his colleagues developed multilevel regression and poststratification, which is used by YouGov and other survey organizations to obtain local estimates from imperfect samples. He has served on the board of the General Social Survey and has worked with the Economist magazine on their election forecasts in 2020 and 2024. Edward Wu is a data, polling, and electric analytics senior producer based in CNN's Washington, D.C. bureau. Ed helps to lead CNN's election night decision desk and works on the network's election and polling methodologies. Prior to joining CNN, Ed held positions of research faculty in the University of Virginia Biocomplexity Institute and Science Policy Fellow at the American Statistical Association. He has a PhD in statistics from the University of Michigan and a bachelor's degree in mathematics statistics from Columbia University. So I'll now turn it over to Ed, who will be interviewing Andrew to start.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And thanks for taking the time to chat with us, Andrew. Really appreciate it. So I just wanted to start with a question on the current election data landscape. We're kind of in a time with more data than ever. There are direct measures of the outcome, such as polling averages, indirect indicators, such as fundraising numbers, early voting data, voter registration data, and economic indicators. There's also past elections. This includes, previous presidential years, previous midterms, but also primaries and special elections. And then there are forecasts and predictions that in many cases combine all these information, such as election models, which I know you're going to talk a lot about today, race ratings, and even like implied percentages based on betting odds. And so my first question for you is, we have many savvy, sophisticated data consumers in this Zoom room. And so for a sophisticated data consumer, what pieces of this landscape are most helpful for understanding what's going on in this election in particular, but just elections in general?
Maybe the best thing to do is for me to say what we're not using, because the most important thing, not the most important thing, but an important aspect of forecasts is transparency, understanding the process from the inputs to the outputs. So we are using historical and current economic data and past voting patterns in previous presidential elections by state. We're obviously using state polls and we're using national polls because most swings are national, so there's a lot of information right there. We are not using information on spending or fundraising or information in the news not reflected in the polls. I think we may be using the presidential popularity as part of our fundamentals-based forecast, but we are not using issue positions, which one would think would be reflected in the polls to the extent that if a candidate is more moderate politically, that candidate would have slightly more support. We're not using that directly. We're not using information from early voting. And we're not using derived properties. So, for example, we're not using other people's forecasts. We're not using betting markets, things like that, which are I would consider derived quantities because betting markets make use of forecasts such as ours. So yeah, there's a lot of, we're not using special elections. We're not using information from primary elections. And so yeah, it's good to be aware of that and be aware of our limitations.
Right. Okay, so that's very helpful. While it is true that you may not be using those in your models, are those some things that you, in trying to interpret your model, might be personally thinking about? Either to kind of get a sense of things that are pretty nebulous, such as voter
Sure.
enthusiasm, or kind of what the current national electoral environment is, how Democratic leaning or Republican leaning it might be.
I think it makes sense to. I haven't really tried. Like, I guess if you kind of had to push me to make some sort of bet, I would somehow try to look at this other information. It's difficult though. I mean, there's another piece of information that we could be using, and we were using in some version of our model, but I don't think it's in our current model, is past patterns of polling errors. So we use it in the sense that we allow for there to be national polling error and state polling errors, systematic errors, non-sampling errors that don't go to zero even when the election approaches. We are not, I don't think in our model we're currently using the fact that in certain states there were some errors in the previous two elections. So that's like potential information. Voter enthusiasm is tough partly because we rely so much on polls, and fewer people respond to polls than vote. And so there's always a concern with polling when you try to adjust for enthusiasm that you're over adjusting because you're actually reaching those very rare people who are so enthusiastic they're willing to participate in a poll. So you can overcorrect for that sometimes. So yeah, I don't really know how to do all that. Like, I guess if I wanted to be quantitative, I'd say put all that together and it's all pretty small. So I think that forecast is what it is, and intermediate information, such as early voting or information about campaign spending, that's stuff that once the election happens, it's going to be easy to tell stories from it. So if the early voting is consistent with later voting, then one can definitely say, well, yeah, sure. There's some being dumped into the campaign and into the campaigns, and when the election happens, if things happen that are unexpected, then people can definitely attribute that about it before, partly because we don't really have great measures of these things even while they're happening.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. Actually, one thing that you mentioned talking about polling errors, that kind of is a convenient transition to one of my next questions, which is, I think one of the challenges of working with election data is that, we have a federal election once every 2 years. We have presidential elections once every 4 years. The circumstances surrounding each election are unique. Like, we might be able to track trends across from election to election, but everyone likes to say this is the most important election of our lifetime. And so we have a pretty limited sample size to work with and some concerns about how well prior elections are going to generalize to the present. So with that in mind, how should we be assessing the performance of both polls, individual or averaged, election models? And is it enough that polls or election models get the margin or the winner right? Or are we looking at more when we're talking about how good a poll is or how well a poll performs?
So yeah, polls are pretty good. The last election, they were off by about maybe 2 or 2.5 percentage points of the vote, which like for most purposes is pretty good, although it's not so great if the election is supposed to be decided within 2 percentage points. So a lot of it has to do with the situation. The polls were off in a bit in 1996, but everybody thought Bill Clinton was going to win, and he did win. So not getting the margin of error perfectly didn't matter so much. I think that, but like, I think they are very accurate. It's just that there are times when even that accuracy isn't enough for what people want. Also, whatever the campaigns are doing is going to be much more sophisticated than what I'm doing. They're working with the voter file. I'm not working with any campaigns. We're using public information. If you want to evaluate forecasts, you don't want to evaluate them based on what the predicting the winning or loser, the winner or the loser. Because if you talk about like states, if a state's a toss-up, then predicting the winner, like you shouldn't get credit for predicting a coin flip correctly. Same with a national election. If people look at historical forecasts and they say, oh, well, this forecast predicted the last 12 national elections or 8 out of the last 9 or whatever, you shouldn't get credit for correctly predicting an election that's basically a tie. You should get credit for predicting that it was going to be close, but not the direction. And it's similar in sports. You get credit in sports for, you should get credit for predicting the vote margin, not the winner, given that there's a lot of randomness going into that. Now, the flip side is, even in the presence of betting, whether it's betting markets or informal bets, it can be hard to, you can see problems with the forecast, but not be able to monetize that exactly. So for example, in 2020, well, our forecast at The Economist had some issues. I think that the interval was a little narrower than I thought it should have been. So in theory, you should be able to make money by betting on tail events. Like maybe there's a tail event that we said had a 1% chance of happening, which is really 2%. Well, in theory, that's a factor of 2. You could make real money off of it. But first, there is not like an existing market for tail events. But even if you wanted to make a bet by like personally embarrassing me, like going up to me and saying, hey, you have this, will you bet on it? And like talking me into doing it, then you're betting on an event with a 2% probability. So you might win, but you'd probably lose. Similarly, in 2020, the 538 forecast at one point had Joe Biden with, I think, a 6% chance of winning South Dakota. Now, at the time, even, I think we all thought that 6% was too high. And I'm pretty sure I know what happened. I think what was happening was that they were tuning their state level forecasts to get an appropriately wide national error. And they didn't have full control over their covariance between states. And I'll tell you, like, I won't tell you details, but I'll just say when we're modeling stuff, getting the covariance is difficult. Like you're talking about multiple covariance matrices in a model, and each one is this 50 by 50 matrix. So you don't have direct data on this. So it's a lot of modeling. It's easy to kind of garble the code or whatever. So I think they were at 538 had very wide intervals for individual states in order that their national aggregate would be sufficiently wide. And as a result, they got things like Joe Biden has a 5% chance, 6% chance of winning South Dakota. They also had something, I don't remember the details, but I think it was a weird conditional forecast where you look at their simulation, and if you conditioned on Trump winning New Jersey, I think his chance of winning Pennsylvania was actually very high. Well, it's a very unlikely event, but it's clearly a flaw in the model. It's some weird artifact at the edge of probability space that arises because they're tuning the model to do the right thing for high probability events. But can I make money off of that? Well, there's not really a place for betting on South Dakota's. If I want to say that Biden had a 3% chance, not a 6% chance of winning in South Dakota, it's not easy for me to bet. And again, even if I could kind of embarrass the proprietors of 538 to make a bet with me. These are these weird tail events, which, so there is a kind of mathematical challenge, which is when can you take low probability events and compound them until you get something closer to a 50-50 bet? Like when, and I don't know the answer to that, because like sometimes you can do this thing like play the field, right? If I have like, if I take a forecaster and say, here's a bunch of rare events, this one's 6%, this one's 2%, you know, they say 6%, I think it's 3%, they say 2%, I say it's 1%, so forth. If I can aggregate them and add enough of them, maybe I'll get something where they say it's 50% and I think it's 25%, then I could make a bet. Well, first, that's a weird trick bet that it's, again, it's not going to exist in any market. It would only exist if you could construct it and embarrass somebody into playing it. But also the events are correlated, and it's not clear how easy it is to create a kind of field event that you could aggregate all of the things that you don't believe in a forecast. So a forecast can leave a lot of money on the table, and that's true of betting markets too. Can leave a lot of conceptual money on the table because they're not really offering all the possibilities that you could use. And you know, for that, campaigns leave a lot of money on the table too. After the campaign, people are always saying they spent their money in the wrong place and they did the wrong thing, even though they had all this information. You're making, you know, they're making real-time decisions, and they have a lot of constraints of their own.
Right. If you don't mind, could we circle back really quickly to
Sorry,
I know you.
I spoke
Yeah,
too
no,
long.
that's great. I think you talked a lot about your thinking on what's going on within an election model. But maybe if you have any thoughts on specifically like what makes a good poll, is this something that you kind of have to wait until after the election and look at things in the aggregate, or do you feel like you can assess really the quality of a poll sort of before we even get to the election itself?
I have not tried to assess qualities of the poll. Like people do that. I mean, speaking generically, you want it to be a representative sample of the population. And there's also issues with question wording, but I think that's less of an issue with vote intention polls because the question's pretty well established and we have decades of experience saying it works pretty well. We did a study a few years ago of polls taken the 3 weeks before the election, state polls of, I think we looked at like 4 election cycles worth of governor, senator, and presidential polls. And we looked at the stated margin of error, and then we looked at the actual standard deviation of how far off the polls were from the actual election outcome. And we found that the actual error was about twice, the standard deviation of the actual error was about twice the official standard deviation of the polls. And some of that is coming from non-sampling error of the usual sort that gets adjusted for in the design effect of a survey, but I think most of it was non-sampling error because the people in the poll, even after adjustment, are not quite representative of who comes out to vote. And of course, people can change their mind. But specifically, yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard because you're attempting to get a representative sample, and you do that partly in the design stage, partly in the analysis stage, and neither is enough. Right. So there is no urn full of voters that we can sample from, or even an urn full of adults that we could sample from. So there is no random sample. Nonetheless, usually some amount of random sampling is a good idea to balance over whatever you can hope would be balanced over that. And then no amount of adjustment is perfect, but you just about always have to do some adjustment. And polls that don't do adjustment, it's because they're doing some sort of quota sampling, like an internet panel with quota sampling, and perhaps they don't need to do adjustment, but then the adjustment's done in the selection in that case.
Great, thanks. One more question, and this pertains more to election modeling itself. Potentially, this is something that you might be covering in your talk. But we've observed increasing partisan gaps in how Americans view the economy. So, for example, the gap in consumer sentiment between Democrats and Republicans has been considerably higher in during the Trump and Biden presidencies than it was in previous presidencies. We know that, when there's a change in administration, there is often a change in how Democrats and Republicans view the economy. So I wonder, given this increasing gap between Democrats and Republicans, has this affected how useful certain indicators are for election modeling? When you kind of confound
Yeah,
economic
the
indicators with
the economy
partisan data.
the economy is a weaker predictor of the election outcome in recent years than it was, decades earlier. So you can see that in the data, and indeed in our fundamentals based model, we do make use of that. Like we have the importance of the economy be proportional to some measure of the number of swing voters. So it is less than it used to be. And it's, we attribute the election results. There were landslide elections in 1964, 1972, and 1984. And we traditionally attribute these to economic performance, the previous year's economic performance. Well, we haven't had that kind of economic boom in the election year recently. But even if we did, I guess at this point we doubt that it would lead to the incumbent party getting 60% of the vote, of the two-party vote, the way it did back then.
Right. Thanks. And just wrapping up, I know that we need to leave time for your talk and for audience questions. But are you optimistic about the future of polling? And kind of unrelated, but still kind of forward-looking, are there any types of data that we haven't discussed that are helpful for understanding and forecasting the election?
Yeah, I think polling's not going anywhere. I think really, there's ridiculously too many polls. I think it's ludicrous when people say things online like, what we really need is a high quality poll of Pennsylvania. Like, why do you need that? Like, okay, we don't know what's happening. It's supposed to be close. You don't need, I think that, maybe the campaigns feel they need these things to make decisions, but I don't even think they need to, because that they might need a poll of a state where they're not sure how close it's going to be. So yeah, the idea that I think polls are a public good. I agree with George Gallup on that, the founder of the Gallup poll, but I don't think we need so many. I don't think it's a public good to keep having these things. But pollsters, yeah, I'm under the impression that they will typically make their money through commercial questions, like asking survey respondents, what would it take for them to buy a new refrigerator or whatever, and then they can throw questions on their survey about who you plan to vote for. That's a kind of loss leader. It's a way to get your poll in the news, and then maybe commercial clients will hear about your poll. So there's a motivation for pollsters to get things right because it helps their reputation. Then there are pollsters that are working directly for campaigns. That would be another story. Yeah, is there information? We have hopes for, like, you can do survey questions where you ask people not just who do you plan to vote for, but the people who do they plan to vote for? Like, there's information that's potentially out there. But yeah, that's
All right. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back to Jonathan and appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Andrew. So, Andrew, we're looking forward to your talk. Tough choices in election forecasting, all the things that can go wrong.
Well, yeah, Ed gave such good questions that, like, I actually only have like 15 minutes to speak, which is fine, because I think I probably said most of what I want to say already. I wanted to just also, I don't think I've ever spoken for the Washington Statistical Society before, and it's a pleasure. Both of my parents worked for the government. My mother worked for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Actually, she was not a statistician. She checked numbers, and that I think she'd call up the companies to check certain numbers in different ways. But I really appreciate, like, well, not just people who work for the federal government, but especially those people and the entire kind of Washington statistical community. I just think is so important, and we think of so many of the innovations that have been developed at the census and the BLS and all sorts of Bureau of Justice statistics and so forth. All these different places in Washington. I was a student at the University of Maryland. So yeah, it's a real honor and pleasure to do so. So my first experience with election forecasting came in 1988 when I was working with a political scientist on a research project. And it was in the summer of 1988, and we were talking about the election, which was coming up. And Mike Dukakis, who was the Democratic nominee, had his convention, and he was leading in the polls. And my political science colleague said that, don't believe it, Bush is going to win. And I said, why that? George W. Bush, that is. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, there's this book, this guy, Stephen Rosenstone, wrote a book a few years ago called Forecasting Presidential Elections. A political scientist who looked, and he found that elections are predictable based on the economy. Candidates didn't seem to matter much, except to the extent that they were more politically moderate. It might give you a percentage point or two of the vote. But it was mostly predictable from the economy and incumbency. There was a small literature, other political scientists and some economists had worked on the topic, and it was agreed. There was a bit of a debate about whether, to what extent voters were thinking retrospectively or prospectively. It connects a little to this idea of how do you think the economy is going. In 1988, a poll was done. They asked people about the economy. More than half the Democrats, if I'm remembering this right, more than half the Democrats in 1988 thought that inflation and unemployment had got worse between 1980 and 1988. But they hadn't. But these are Democrats, and Reagan had been in power. It was natural to believe that. There was some kind of argument that, well, maybe this is prospective thinking, right? So if you are a Republican right now and you say the economy is trash, even though actually using most measures of economic performance, the economy is doing just fine, the argument would be you think the economy is trash because you don't trust the Democrats to run it, or you might say, I think the economy is in bad shape because the national debt is so high. Well, what if I were to say, but if a Republican were president, national debt might be higher, then you, the Republican, might say, well, sure, but I think that when the Republicans raise the national debt, they're doing it for a good reason, and when the Democrats are doing it, they're wasting the money and not investing it in our future, and who knows. But the point is, these survey findings are very difficult to interpret. That all said, my colleague was right that George H.W. Bush did win the election. In 1988, he got about 54% of the two-party vote, which nowadays might be considered a landslide, although in 1988 it was considered moderately close election. Close enough that people thought if only the Democrats had campaigned differently, maybe the election would have happened differently, which I don't think, but that's what people say. So that was the first thing. Kind of foundational to me was this idea that the political scientists knew or thought they knew who were going to win before the voters themselves knew. And the other thing, which was similar, is as I was sitting in the office, this guy's office in 1988, and he actually had tickets to the Dukakis campaign celebration in Boston. And we were sitting there, and the news came in. I think Kentucky was the first state, and it went for the Republicans, and he said, well, given that, we shouldn't bother going, because he knew he could estimate the relative positions of the states. And if Kentucky was where it was, he knew it wasn't even going to be close. So we didn't go to the party, which I guess would have been a sad party. This was the days before there were a zillion state polls. It was just based on previous election outcomes. You could see that. So a couple things: you can forecast the national election well, and using the economy and previous votes, and you can predict the relative positions of the state elections pretty well based on what happened in the previous election. Things don't change that much from one to the other. We wrote a paper about why it is that polls are so variable when elections are so predictable. In order to write that poll, we needed to actually forecast the election. So we forecast the 1992 election, did not get any media exposure for it. The forecast did not use any contemporaneous polls, because our purpose was not to forecast the election. Our purpose was to demonstrate the election could be forecast using information available before the campaign. We got a pretty good forecast, but even before the election, we knew it was kind of wrong. One thing was that it predicted Bill Clinton was going to do better. It gave him too high a chance in a bunch of southern states. And I guess there had been enough polling. We were skeptical of that. We looked at our model, and the model included home state and home region effects. Bill Clinton didn't do so bad in the South, but he didn't do as well as in the South as you might have expected, given that he was a Southerner. As always with these models, there are also these judgment calls, like how much does George H.W. Bush count as a Southerner? He was from Texas, but he wasn't a Southerner like Bill Clinton was a Southerner. Like maybe we counted it half. I can't remember. The point being that we could still forecast the election pretty well without using contemporaneous polls, although the election had systematic problems. The forecast had systematic problems that we could see. Since then, things have changed. So we had a whole story about how polls are predictable. The election is predictable even though the polls vary a lot. And our story was that voters don't always, that early on in the campaign, they haven't really thought things through. They eventually do come home to their party. Things have changed. Nowadays, voters seem to come home from their party before the party begins. They're there right at the beginning of the campaign. There's very little motion. Since 2000, polls have been very stable. There are occasional things. They're traditionally when the candidate does the convention. When there's a convention, the candidate improves in the polls. Always a bit of a mystery to me, because what if somebody told you, hey, who do you plan to vote for? And they say they plan to vote for, and then you say, one of the candidates is going to have a convention. What they're going to do is have a bunch of positive publicity about this person, a bunch of people in silly hats making speeches, wall-to-wall coverage. How's your opinion going to change? And supposedly 5 to 10% of the people would say, oh, yeah, okay, in that case, I'm going to change my view. It's kind of weird. Like, it's always these other people who gets, it's similar to like our lack of understanding of political ads, that it's, the general belief is almost every ad helps, which I guess is true, probably, but it's kind of weird because you'd think it would only help if it were better than expected, right? People know who the candidates are. So when it comes to the convention, we looked at this in 2016, and we found that when candidates are doing better in the polls, when Democrats are doing better in the polls, typically more Democrats are responding to the poll. And Republicans are doing better in the polls, typically Republicans are responding more. So we call that differential non-response. And we hadn't really looked at this historically, but we think that explains a lot of the fluctuations. So fluctuations in the polls tend to be magnified. If there's good news for a candidate, they would, there'd be some increase in support for them, but also more enthusiasm, which will translate into more survey responses. But now we're seeing such small swings that, well, whether or not they're magnified, they're still small in any case. And some polls now do adjust for previous vote, or just for previous vote or party ID. And And you can get better answers that way. I think you should. A few years ago, Sharon Lohr and Michael Brick reanalyzed the famous Literary Digest poll from 1936 that some of you might have heard about or taught in your introductory courses. And this was a poll that was way off, thought Franklin Roosevelt was going to lose the election. The survey did ask people who they voted for in the previous election. And if you adjust for that by state, you don't get a perfect forecast, but it actually got the winner right. It was a lot better. So even back in 1936, there was potential for adjusting for previous vote or party identification. I'm just going to say a couple more words and then I'll stop and then we'll have time for discussion. So as I said, we use state and national polls. We use the economy-based forecast and historical election results by state as a prior. We include sampling error and non-sampling error. The non-sampling error is correlated between states. There's evidence that the non-sampling error is correlated from year to year, meaning we looked at like 20 years of data. Merlin Heidemann's former PhD student looked at this as part of his thesis. And you see that when there's polling error, systematic polling error in a state in one election, it has a small correlation, like maybe 0.3 correlation with the polling error in the next election. We're not actually using that. We allow for opinion drift. So we have a model which says that public opinion can change. It's mathematically a random walk model, but you shouldn't think of it as a random walk. Sometimes we call it a reverse random walk, which is kind of weird because mathematically a random walk is symmetric if you flip it. But our prior is on the election outcome. So if public opinion is somewhere now, you should not have the model that here we are now and then things could go up or down and it's a random walk. Even less so should you have a model like here's a change and now you're going to see a trend. Okay, that's kind of a mistaken way of thinking about it. I think a better way of saying it is there's an election outcome that's going to happen and here are the polls now. The polls might be moving around and they're going to end up at the election outcome. So where we are now, I like to say, like, if currently the forecast, the polls, and in this case, the fundamentals are forecast as close to the polls. So currently the forecast is that the Democrats will win about, Democratic candidate will win about 51 or 52 percentage points of the popular vote. And the Electoral College could go either way because of the distribution of the votes in the state. That doesn't mean that 51% of the people currently support Harris of the two-party voters, because it's just our estimate and there could be polling error. So we have to avoid this kind of random walk thinking. People are sometimes interested in prediction markets, which are fine. They make use of the polls. They make use of poll aggregates. If there were no poll aggregators and no forecasters, people would just be trying their best to aggregate and forecast in their head. I think there's some evidence that prediction markets are more stable than they used to be, possibly because they respect the aggregates, which themselves are very stable. The paradox of poll aggregation is that once you do this, there's very little news. So people who say I click on your website every day to see what's happening. I say, well, stop clicking on my website because nothing much is changing. The models are there. So if there's a big change, a big jump in the polls, the forecast models will try their best to integrate that in. It's the nature of surprises that they happen rarely. Maybe you don't get any big surprises during a campaign, so you're usually not going to see much change. One way a forecaster can turn something that's not news into news is by reporting the predicted forecast probability the 1/10 of a percentage point. So instead of saying the election's about tie, instead of saying that each candidate has roughly 50% chance of winning, you could say that Harris has a 51.3% chance of winning, or maybe it went up to 57.8%, down to 54.3%. These are kind of close to meaningless numbers. A rule of thumb we calculated is that a 10 percentage point shift in win probability corresponds to a roughly 0.4% shift in forecast two-party vote share. So if one forecast is saying 50%, the other is saying 60%, that's like one forecast maybe saying that the candidate would get 51.4% of the vote, and the other forecast saying that she would get 51.8% of the vote. 0.4% of the vote's important. It's a big deal in a close election, but it's really below our, beneath our ability to measure. So these little changes are just not really telling us anything. But again, I think the forecasts are valuable if, like, for conveying our uncertainty and in their stability, that gives us information too. There's been so much news. If you imagine in the absence of polls and forecasts, we would just be making all sorts of assumptions about voters swinging back and forth. And the fact that in the polls they're not responding to news is interesting. It might be encouraging to people, or it might be frustrating to people. There's a funny thing going on, this last thing I'll say, there's a funny thing going on a few months ago, or even now, this idea that the economy is doing well and yet voters are not seeming, responding to it. Because for many years, it was framed the other way, that it was generally believed that the election was largely determined by what happened in the economy in the election year. And there was a feeling that that wasn't good, that there was a motivation for parties to manipulate the government and power to manipulate the economy, the idea that voters have no memory, it seemed kind of bad. So from that perspective, the idea that there's all this good economic news and voters still think the economy is bad, I don't know if that's encouraging or not, but we have to put this in the context of earlier concerns about voters overreacting to the short-term economy. So if there are questions or comments, this is the time.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. That was great. I'm going to put Ed again in the spotlight, add spotlight. And then everyone else is on mute. So if you have a question, I can unmute you to ask it, or you can put it in the chat. If not, I will go through all the questions I find interesting. So maybe I'll just until people decide they want to ask a question in the chat or raise their hand. Maybe I could just ask about, suppose you have people, maybe students, who are thinking about research in this area. What are some interesting problems that they could tackle?
I think a lot of it's as with sports, like the most interesting stuff is going on in the teams, not in the sports statistics literature. So similarly, I think stuff happening in campaigns and among political consultants, that's pollster, what working at a pollster survey organization, that's going to be a lot more interesting than doing this aggregation. And one thing, it's funny because people say, like, why are you doing all this aggregation? I say very little information, very little effort's going into aggregation. Like my two colleagues of mine at Columbia, worked with these people at The Economist. We spent, I don't know, like 20 hours helping them out. The people at The Economist, they have people working on it, but it's not all that they're doing. This is like something that their data science team is doing. Like this is all, I think it's good that we're doing it. It's transparent. It's a result of years of research. We use STAN, which was a big programming effort, but ultimately we're not putting huge amounts of effort. I think the research that's more interesting is at the much more granular level. Although for me, as someone who writes textbooks and does methodological research, working on relatively simple problems like this is helpful. Also, with regard to the forecast itself, I think a lot of the most interesting area of research to make progress is modeling and learning about the covariance matrices better, and also modeling and learning systematic errors in polls, because those are two places where we kind of kludge things in our model because we just didn't feel we had like the time to get everything working at a level that. One way we tested the model was we would before releasing it, we said, what if the poll did this? What if the polls did this? What would the forecast be? How extreme would the polls have to be before we get to forecasts where one candidate has a 99% chance of winning, things like that. So methodologically, that's interesting. So methodologically, if you read the textbooks, including our own, it's like set up a model, fit the model, the data, maybe check the fit. The idea of evaluating the model by actually working out hypotheticals is something we do all the time in our workflow, but it tends not to be written up. And I think there's a lot of like research to be done in that area, not just in polling. Like, that idea is very general.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm going to cut to the seminar room. There seems to be a question over there. That's where a lot of the Mason people are aggregated.
So hi, Andrew, it's Bill Rosenberger. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to hear you talk about the big business of polls, how some universities have become known just for polling. I'm thinking of one in particular that begins with a Q, and that it really doesn't matter whether you get it right or not. The publicity is really the end game.
I quite hear your question, although regarding the business of polls, as I said, I think that it's my impression that they typically make their money from commercial for selling space on their polls for commercial questions.
So can you hear me now better?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So let me repeat the question. So it's the big business of polling, how some universities have become known just for polling. I'm thinking in particular of one that begins with a Q, and that it really doesn't matter whether you get it right or not. The publicity is really the end game.
Oh, no, I don't think that's true. I think if you get wrong, it's embarrassing. I think a few years ago, after 2012, maybe, Gallup stopped doing the horse race polls because they were so far off that it was embarrassing to them. Now, they have a reputation, right? So it makes sense that they don't want to risk their reputation. One thing, yeah, so I think I think that the more a pollster is invested in election polling, the more that they have a motivation to get things right. And that otherwise, and one thing that's interesting to me, though, that I've written about is the motivation of forecasters, because the motivation for the Economist forecast, I think, like, we want to do it and be out there, but we really don't want to look bad. I think the downside's more than the upside. So when we're constructing a forecast, we want to make sure to avoid getting really extreme probabilities, because that could make us look bad. Being a little too vague is maybe better if you had to choose. On the other hand, some forecasters want to produce news, and you'll see different, like, we had to make a choice in our forecast of how much variation we thought could happen between, let's say, August and November in public opinion. And that's based on historical information. If you take history back to 1948 or even 1980, you can see big swings between August and November. If you start history in the year 2000, you see smaller swings. So what do you do? This is just what assumptions do you make? There's no answer, no easy answer. And we ended up choosing what happened, something a little broader than what happened since 2000 as a baseline. But then other forecasters were giving much broader forecasts. 538 was giving a much broader forecast, and I think it's because they were allowing for much bigger swings. And people didn't understand that. Like, you have people on social media saying, oh, 538, they're not using, this is when Biden was still running, they're not using all the poll information. What is that? Like, why are they discounting polls? They're trying to cheat. It's like, no, the polls were months before the election, and their model was allowing for 1980s style swings. We're allowing for that possibility. And the more uncertainty you allow, the closer your prediction is going to be to 50-50. So anyway, just I gave a long answer, running out the clock because now it's 12. But yeah, there are. Let's just say that forecasters have incentives too. It's me as an established statistician. My incentive is to avoid embarrassing myself, so I'm always hedging my bets. Other people want to get their names out there, or they're partisans, and they're willing to roll the dice, right? If you want to roll the dice and make a strong forecast that one of the two candidates is going to do really well, you should go for it, because it really could happen. It could happen that the election's not super close, and if you get it right, maybe you can really make bank on that. And if you get it wrong, well, nobody's listening to you anyway, so maybe it doesn't matter.
Thanks, Andrew. I know we're running out of time. Maybe real quick, we get some of these chat questions. So we have a question about non-response. What are the response rates of the typical poll? And then we have a question about Harris declared relatively late. So I guess you have a shorter time series. What's been the impact there? Andrew, maybe quickly, and then Ed, if you've got some.
Yeah, with Harris deciding late, there's just so many damn polls that it just doesn't really matter that much for the forecasting model. Especially with the random walk model, it doesn't really matter. You don't get much information from what happened a few months earlier. Response rates, it's funny because back in the day, survey response rates were in the 67, 80% rate, like back in the 50s, and people would write, who are these non-respondents? How can we reach these people? 20%, and people started writing papers. Who are these survey respondents? Who are these weird people who respond to polls? It's a little weird. Response rates, I think, are less than 5% now. It's hard to measure because a lot of pollsters use internet panels. So you recruit people and then you pay them, and then so then it's not a conventional response rate anymore. It's something different. So you can't completely compare them based on that. But I actually think it's kind of unconscionable or immoral for pollsters to call people up and get surveys for free. They're making money off of you. I don't respond to polls like that. They should be paying you. I think that the goodwill of survey respondents is a kind of aquifer that's been tapped for 80 years and is finally running out, which is really only fair. Back in the 1950s, if the Gallup poll were to poll you, you'd be one of 1,500 people. The result would be reported in newspapers across the country. It was arguably more rational to respond to a survey than to vote. Nowadays, there's so many surveys that one survey response is not going to matter. And so there's less reason to respond. So you have less of a motivation.
Thanks, Andrew. Ed, any you guys gonna start paying people soon for polls? Or other comments?
Well, I just wanted to add onto the first question on Harris's late candidacy. I think one of the interesting dynamics here, or in this race specifically, is that it was a rematch of 2020. Donald Trump has been constantly in the public eye since 2015. And Biden has been in the public eye for even longer. So I think initially it seemed as if there might be a little bit more uncertainty, right, with the need for Harris to define herself in the race. But from what we've observed in the polls, the race has been pretty steady. So I think there is still that uncertainty in terms of how we interpret a poll of Harris versus Trump compared to a poll of Biden versus Trump. But in the end, I think fundamentally, the problem statistically hasn't changed. So, I think there's something very interesting in terms of interpretation, in terms of uncertainty, and yet things are somewhat stable.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps been surprising to people how stable things are. I guess that's part of political polarization, is that you got a lot of people hating the other party. So not a lot of people love either party, but a lot of people hate the other one. So that's it. It seems, as a political scientist, I'd say it seems like an unstable situation when you have polarization defined by large numbers of people hating the other party and not liking their own party. in the U.S. famous two-party system is very stable, but will it last forever? That's another story.
Great. All right. So then the last questions, just to keep it to a tight hour. Someone asked about how forecast aggregation, to what respects is it like a classical learning problem with multiple features? And then another person asked about, what R packages are you guys using if you're using R? So maybe you can both handle both questions in a response.
Oh, yeah. Well, we fit the model in Stan, so we're using Stan. I don't know whether I'm not sure if they're running it from R or from Python. It doesn't matter that much. Yeah, I think the key is that we're using multiple sources of information. That we're using the previous election outcomes, and we're using this fundamentals-based model, and we're using national polls and state polls. And the way we do it is through multiple error terms and covariance matrices. We're not doing poll averaging. We're not weighting polls. We're not down weighting stuff. We're not making the weights of the polls change as we get closer to the election. That's all implicit. We're fitting a model. That's not the only way of doing it, but it's how I like to do it. I think when we see problems, it's easy. I think it's easier to fix a model than to fix a procedure. If you frame it as I'm doing a bunch of weights and the weights have to change, and then I start adding error terms, and like, how do you make the weights change? It's a bunch of choices that need to be made that are not so intuitive to me. With a model, we can simulate replicated data. Again, not that what we're doing is perfect, but I like this general workflow.
Thanks, Ed. Any tools or you want to?
We're using Stan. That's our tool. We're doing it in Stan.
All right, Andrews, you guys using Stan? Ed, what are you guys using? And then we'll end it.
I mean, I mostly use R when working with data, but I think that was more about the sort of election modeling side, which I currently do not do.
All right, thanks. Okay, so Andrew, any last thoughts you want to leave everybody with?
No, great. It's a pleasure to speak before this group, even if only remotely.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Ed, any last thoughts?
I just wanted to reiterate, thank you for your time, Andrew. It's really enlightening to hear your thoughts on election modeling and the election.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. I hereby end the seminar. Everyone have a great day. Please come to the next George Mason or Washington Statistical Society event. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.